Welcome back. I realize that I talk way too loud at the beginning of each of these videos, so I'm going to try to mellow it out a little bit, even though I am super excited that we are talking about the latter Middle Ages, or later, meaning the Black Death. Okay, so let's just dive right into it. Alrighty, so the later Middle Ages, we're going to first talk about what led up to basically this giant disaster. So we see that Europe is overpopulated. There are way too many people. Many of them were sleeping in one room or even one bed. There's also the very, very, very poor sanitation of most cities. And then during this time, they experience what's known as a little ice age. So there's going to be shorter growing periods, much colder temperatures, which means there's going to be a number of storms like snow that will destroy crops, leaving poor harvests. Now, if we've learned anything, it's when there's too many people and not enough food that creates conflict, right? So is exactly what's going to happen during this later part of the Middle Ages. The results of the Little Ice Age are not good. They have what's called the Great Famine, which lasts from 1315 to 1322. We see crops failing, and even in non-famine years, the cost of food was going to be high. So now during the famine years, food is extremely expensive. We see an increase in vulnerability to disease. This just makes sense. When people are not receiving the proper nutrients, their bodies can't fight off disease as well, right? So, enter the Black Death. So the Black Death is known as the bubonic plague. It was caused by the Bacillus Yersinia pestis. Basically, it was spread by fleas on rats. So there were 3 steps to this disease. There is a gross picture over here, so I'm going to try to go very quickly for those of you who don't want to see it. Basically, the first step is you contract the disease, right? And once you start to develop symptoms, the first symptoms is you see the growth of bubo, which are these like boils all over your body. Second is the appearance of black spots. Basically, you're internally bleeding, all right? So you're bleeding under your skin. And lastly, the final step was you began to cough blood, which meant death would quickly follow. So originally, the plague developed started in southeast China in 1331. It was then spread by the Mongols as biological warfare. So they were trying to siege Kaffa. What they did is they took the dead bodies of plague victims and hurled them over the city walls. Then, people touched the bodies to move them out of the way. They contracted the disease and then it spread. From that point on, fleas and then the rats that they lived on went among the bodies, contracted the disease, and then quickly went to ships and trade routes, right? Because the rats are driven by food and motivation survival. So then they are going to travel the world, bringing the plague to all these different trading ports. So Europe is going to be hit full force by 1348. I'll go back to talk about these dates in a little bit. Constantinople will be hit in 1346, Sicily in 1347, the ports of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa by 1347, and then across rest of Europe by 1348. So you notice here in 1346 where we see the appearance of the plague and it just progresses. So there are natural, social, and economic consequences. 30 to 40% of Europe will die. Okay, so it's about a third of the population on the continent of Europe. In densely populated cities, they're hit the hardest. So that means the larger number of people living more closely together, they'll be affected. Now, there's a lot of similarities that we can see throughout history with the bubonic plague and other pandemics, like the one we're living in now. For example, these cities with larger populations where people are living closer together, the disease spreads more quickly, or you see more cases of it simply because people are living closer to each other, right? Let's look back at the Paleolithic era, when we were hunters and gatherers and we were nomadic, meaning we moved from place to place. We were less likely to contract disease or spread disease because we were living in our small kinship groups. These kinship groups were what, 25 to 50 people at most, and they were constantly moving. So there wasn't really this interaction between different types of people. Whereas during the Neolithic era, as soon as the agricultural revolution began, we stopped moving and we started staying put. We became sedentary, we built up our homes, and we started living closer to one another. As cities grew, populations grew, disease spread. It's just a common consequence of living close to each other. All right, mini rant over. Looking at Florence, to be specific, it had one of the highest populations that lived super close to each other. Their population died. Only a third of them were left. So we're looking at different statistics that say people in Florence, half to two-thirds of them died from the bubonic plague. People are going to flee to Poland, Bohemia, and Hungary. We're also going to see the decline of farms. So the number of laborers decreases, obviously, right, because the labor force is being killed by this plague. People are malnourished. So this will result in an increase of wages. Now you might be thinking, oh, this is really good that, people are going to get paid more. It doesn't work that way. We see the price, though, of agriculture drop. So you're making less money on crops that you would have a few years ago, but you're paying your workers more, you're going to be in debt. Now, during this time, there's lots and lots of artwork to depict the bubonic plague. And what this depiction here is meant to show you is that the plague did not affect a certain age group or a certain social class. Everybody was affected. And the plague took out anyone and everyone. So here you have a small child. You have what looks to be like a merchant, right? You have some sort of nobleman or a queen here with crowns or a king on his head. And it's a death march, right? So the point being, old, young, rich, poor, everyone was affected. Again, here you see coffins of the dead loved ones trying to be buried. It was horrible. Again, another artwork where it depicts, death is leading these people. This is meant to represent the Pope, the king, right? And then a noblewoman. So just because you were rich didn't mean that you were exempt from getting it. So who took care of the sick? Well, physicians tried many different things to prevent and treat the plague. Next week, you're going to have a fun assignment where I have a primary source document that specifically lists a bunch of remedies that they tried to use to ward off the plague or to cure people of it. And spoiler alert, some of them are super ridiculous. So we're going to look more deeply into that. But for the most part, priests, monks, and nuns were the ones who were caring for the sick. Best of the clergy is going to die as a result, right? Because they don't have any concept of germs or contamination. They're going to try things like ringing church bells, firing cannons, and flowers to protect themselves. This is a common depiction of a plague doctor, so this is the mask that they would wear. Here in the beak portion of the mask, they would put incense or flowers, basically to knock out the smell of the dead rotting flesh, the dead rotting flesh, but also B, they thought that some of these flowers would actually protect them from the plague. We see people fleeing cities shutting their gates, and people really didn't understand what was causing this disease, so they thought it was a punishment from God. As a result, they would flagellate themselves. That's what this word here is, flagellants. Basically, they would make whips and beat themselves as penance for their sins. And we're not talking like light smacks, we're talking we need to draw blood. So this was a very dark time in world history and in church history. People would walk through the streets flagellating themselves, beating themselves. So the economy obviously is not going to fare well. We see labor shortages resulting in higher wages. Guilds are going to be forced to accept new men that necessarily aren't keeping up with the standards. Women, we will get more opportunities. So this is unfortunately for the world, but good for us. A little bit of a push in the right direction for us to receive better rights. Religion. So religion's going to go one of two ways. Either people are going to become more religious or they're going to give up on religion completely. Which, you can understand, right? If you're going through something horrible like this and you don't understand your faith well enough, then if you think God is kind of like Santa and you just have to be good and ask him for something, well, what's going to happen when you ask God, oh, please heal my cousin or, my mother or my sibling or my husband or my wife or my children or whatever, and they don't get cured? You're either going to develop a very negative view of God and religion and say, I'm done with this is made up, or you're going to take a darker turn just on the opposite end and say, oh man, I must have done something super horrible and God is angry with me. All right, so that's going to affect the church. Culturally, we see the Jews being blamed for the plague. This is one of the main things that Hitler will use during World War II to justify the eradication of the Jewish people. He's going to use what happened during the bubonic plague. Let me give you the short rundown. Culturally speaking, the Jewish faith requires its its members, not practicers, but people who practice the faith to be very clean, right? It's part of their rituals, it's part of their ceremonies. So people of Jewish faith did not have unclean homes. Rats like messes. They like dirtiness. They like food being left out. So naturally, the rats would not cling as much to the homes of the Jewish people rather than, let's say, your Aunt Mary who has bread everywhere and chickens running in and out of the house, and her house is just filthy, right? So people are going to start blaming Jewish people because they're not getting sick at as high a rate as everyone else. Instead, they're going to say, oh, they're poisoning the water and this is their fault. And so that's going to create a lot of animosity. As a result, we see a lot of people being persecuted, specifically Jewish people being persecuted and burned alive at the stake for the bubonic plague. It's not a good time. So that video, that's a Fleas on Rats video. I've been waiting all year to show you guys. There's a link on the page for you to watch it. It's to Gwen Stefani's Hollaback Girl, but it's about the bubonic plague. It's super hilarious. Anyways, that's a little glimpse. You can watch the full video. I think it's funny and it's historically accurate. It explains what happened. So now we get into the 100 Years' War. So 1337 to 1453. Causes of the war. England and France, they're two territorial powers. They are not going to get along. France at the time has no heir to take over the country, so the King of England is like, yo, it's mine now. Naturally, the French people are not super excited that a English king is going to come take their territory, so they fight back. So French, unfortunately for them, they've got a lot of weaknesses. They have 3 times the population. They are wealthier, but they're going to fight the war on their own soil. So they're going to start to splinter in the beginning. They're not as centralized, meaning they're not as organized. So the majority of battles before 1415 are going to be lost to the English. The English are just superior in strategy and in technology. They are more disciplined, and they have a long bow, which can shoot 6 arrows a minute, and it's able to pierce armor at 200 yards away. So they have the advantage here. But then here enters Joan of Arc. We don't have a lot of time to get into her story, which I'm super bummed about, but you can definitely look her up. She's one of the more famous Catholic saints in the Catholic Church. There's a religion aspect to it as well. So Joan of Arc, she's really young. I want to say 16 years old when she feels called by God to unite the French people and fight in the war, right? So she goes to the generals and basically through all these miracles, she's able to lead the French soldiers. She unites them with a national identity. And basically she's like, God is behind us. God is with us. We are French. We are proud. We can't just lay back and let the English take over our land. So she actually leads so many successful battles, which helps the French create like a turning point in war. Unfortunately for her, though, she's going to be accused of being a heretic, so going against God. She'll be captured and turned over to the Inquisition, which we talked about in the other video. The Inquisition was this big court declared by the Pope to determine who was a heretic and who was, going against the church. She will be burned alive at the stake for being a heretic on May 30th in 1431. Now, after her death, 25 years later, the King Charles at the time declares that she actually was innocent. All right. And then in 1920, the Catholic Church is going to declare her a saint. So they realize, oh, yeah, she was telling the truth. Super horrible time with the Inquisition. We'll talk more about that later. In the aftermath of the war will end in 1453 with about 68 years of decent peace, with 44 years of really intense war. There's going to be a lot of financial loss and a decrease in interregional trade, meaning trade back and forth between England and France. We do see, though, the spreading of the longbow and cannon technology, as well as new monarchs, which are going to have paid professional armies. This is super important. As a result, we see the growth of nationalism. So, nationalism is that feeling of pride and unity for your country. It binds people together. So, it's like me saying, well, I'm an American, or I'm French, or I'm Italian. It gives you pride, it gives you a sense of ownership to your country, and a sense of community amongst everyone living in that region. Doing a lot of hand motions, like literally coming together. And we can thank Joan of Arc for that. She was the key to this growth of nationalism. So this will obviously create some troubles for the medieval church. They're going to be weakened by earlier successes. They're also going to become extremely corrupt and out of touch as a result. So as money keeps pouring in, more and more people, the church is made up of sinners, right? So more and more people are going to be super greedy and become corrupt. All right, it's human nature. The king, in addition, is going to start to tax church land. We then see the Great Schism of the West. So, what happens during this time is multiple men, in hopes of gaining financial wealth and prestige, they're going to declare themselves the one true pope, right? So, they're saying, oh, the pope living in the Vatican, nope, he's not the real true pope. I am. Now, these men are going to have girlfriends and wives and illegitimate children on the side. It is a very dark time in church history. We're going to see challengers to the throne, not, I shouldn't call it the throne, to the chair of Peter, right? So to the Pope. Basically, we're going to have this conciliar movement, which ends the schism, it roots out heresy, and it resorts back to the old system of one Pope. So these heretics are going to slowly but surely be dwindling down until they are no longer a part of the church, they're driven out. The church will reform. It's still going to be corrupt, but it's not going to be as bad, if you can picture that. So all of these things are going to lead up to the Renaissance period. So the cultural world of the 14th century, we see the foundation being set for the Renaissance. Vernacular literature is going to develop during this time. We have beautiful masterpieces being written like Dante's Inferno, about heaven and hell. We see new art by Giotti, and then we see the impact of the Black Plague affecting urban life. So family life starts to revive itself. We see new technology, new inventions. Art at this time just explodes. The types of art, it's the architecture. It's actually a great time in Europe to it revives itself. It reinvents itself, and it lays the foundation for the Renaissance. Europe is going to be in transition. So for years and years and years, Europe was very faith-based, right? So they had a lot of connections to the Pope rather than their king. But we're going to see this shift from religion to state. The 14th century is going to be where we see the church declining, stability declining. Um, it's going to be really unfortunate for the church, the separation of church and state. They're going to lose a lot of power, but it's good in the sense that we now see the development of more modern day countries like France, Europe, Poland, Germany. And this all begins during the Renaissance. So, with that, we conclude for the week.